Hi, my name is Ollie and I am a writer and director from Germany. A while ago, I've released a 10-minute horror short film called Emily's Monster on YouTube. This was my first short film and I know pretty well how difficult it can be to get started with your own project. So this video is going to be sort of a step-by-step of how I made my first film and hopefully give you a bit of an idea about how to make yours. If you have not watched the short film yet, check it out before you watch this because I'm gonna get into some spoilers. I made this horror short as a second semester project in film school, and although I've done some short documentaries before and I've worked on a couple of other short films, I've never written, directed or produced a full narrative short film, but I definitely had some experience. So, how to make your first short film? First off, you need an idea. What I've always found helpful is creating sort of an idea mess before I start writing. So let's say you have a very basic starting point for a short film, maybe a character or a location or maybe just an image in your head. Now take a piece of paper and start writing down everything that comes to mind regarding that idea. It really can be anything. Play with ideas for the plot, write down different characters that would be interesting, watch other movies and short films you like and write down everything that could be used in your story. You know, the beautiful thing is that you can write down the biggest crap and no one has to ever read it. This also takes you away from the problem of facing a blank page, because after a while you have pages full of potential material for your story, and now you have at least something to work with. I won't go into writing this short film specifically here, since I don't think the movie is the best example for screenwriting, to be honest, but this process is definitely something I found very helpful for my own work. For the writing itself, I used Celtext, which is a cheap script writing app, and you can even get an older version for free. It is a great alternative for some of the other more expensive options out there, and it has pretty much all you need. If you have difficulties formatting your script and maybe finding the right way to describe your scene, I recommend looking at some other screenplays and see how they've done it. You can get a lot of scripts even for some really big movies for free online, and I've put a few of my favorite screenplays in the description as well. After you finished your script, it's time to actually make your film. For this, the two big things I needed were actors and locations. To get actors for your project is actually not as hard as you might think at first. There are a lot of casting websites and Facebook groups dedicated just for casting. You will be surprised of how many people will actually contact you after you put up a casting call. Just make sure you clarify in your casting call that you're a no-budget production and that you won't be able to pay actors. The usual trade-off is that the actors work for free on your movie and in return they can use the movie in their demo reels. But you usually still have to pay for catering and traveling costs, so keep that in mind before you cast actors from the other side of the world. As for the locations, I needed a house, a garden and some sort of basement. Luckily, a friend of mine told me that he once filmed something in a show house. You know, those manufactured houses that are on display so buyers can take a look around. So I just asked that company and sure enough, they were totally cool with us filming there for a few days. Another advantage of filming there was that the interior was already fully furnished and decorated by an architect, so everything looked pretty good right away. Something like this yellow wall or green tiles in the bathroom really give a location character. Unfortunately, there were just plain white walls in the hallway, so we had to do our best with lighting to make it somewhat interesting. I also started scouting different basements, which means that I started asking a lot of people I knew how the basement looked like. But then I remembered that we had this great old vaulted cellar in my family's house, which is actually a really creepy place, and I could film there whenever I want. You know, in the script it just said that the hand of the monster was coming out of a dark corner of the room, which is why I didn't think of that location at first. Well, the dark corner ended up being an endless dark void, which is actually a lot cooler than what's in the script. When you're making your first film, try to think of what you have available right now, most of all when it comes to the locations. This is one of the reasons why a lot of films do much of their shooting in a studio rather than on location. Another big thing we needed for the movie was of course a monster. I wanted something simple and I wanted to do it practically, mostly because I didn't want to deal with heavy visual effects in my first short film. I started with collecting a few different images that resembled the direction I wanted to go with. The influences here are pretty obvious. Then I've asked a friend of mine to create some concept art. Because I wanted something simple, we quickly settled on just a pitch black cloak. The mask was a bigger problem, but we also went with a pretty simple design here. Another friend of mine who has experience in some cosplay then made the actual costume. For the hands I found these old rubber hands which we painted and put some nails on. But for an alternative you can always buy a cheap Halloween mask and make that one work with some fake blood and the right lighting. Because this was my first short film, I prepared myself as much as I could. I watched a few other movies, looked for inspiration and made a full shortlist in advance. I definitely took some very strong inspiration while doing this, but more on that later. I didn't do much storyboarding on this one, but I knew pretty well what I wanted the movie to look like and how the shots are gonna work together in the edit later on. Of course, much of the plan is going to change on set anyways because of logistics or time, but it's always good to have a plan before you start filming. We used the Canon 5D Mark III as our main camera with some Volumex lenses, which we borrowed from a film school. But that camera wasn't always available, so we had to switch to a Mark II for 1 or 2 days. And we even filmed the last day with my own old Canon 700D, so nothing fancy. For lighting, I didn't want to rely on our university equipment, so just before the shoot I bought 3 800-watt Red Hat lamps on eBay for around €100. They're super bright, they do the job, and most importantly, they're cheap. Other than a simple reflector, we didn't use much else, but this was also plenty for the limited space we had on location. I mean, it's a house, how many lamps are you gonna put there anyway? Other equipment we used were my Manfrotto tripod, this slider, and some basic sound equipment. We could also only shoot during daytime, which meant that we had to darken all the windows. Because I didn't have a budget for the movie and no experience running a film crew, I wanted to keep the number of people on set to a minimum. It was usually me as director, my director of photography, a sound guy, an assistant director, and the actors. But one day it was also just me and my DOP on set. And my DOP also played the monster, by the way, which was fine because the monster actually doesn't appear all that much in the movie. And when it did, I just took over the camera myself. So we were never more than 5 people in the crew. And I must say, overall, you don't really need more people for this type of movie. Sure, a couple of extra hands here and there would be helpful, and of course you can't do every movie like that, but for this one, it totally worked. We ended up shooting for 5 days. Day 1 we filmed the opening with Emily, day 2 was the basement, day 3 the whole section where Lily comes home and starts searching for Emily, day 4 we filmed the scenes outside and the ending, and day 5 was the bathroom and the scene after Lily escapes the basement. Our longest day by far was day 2, where we filmed all the basement stuff. And we didn't even get to any of the shots of the monster's hand that day, so I decided to push it to an extra reshoot day that I could do on my own. This wasn't a problem because again it is my family's house and I could shoot there basically anytime I want. So for that day I've asked a friend of mine to act as sort of a hand double for the monster, because she has very small hands that could actually fit in the rubber hand. By far the most difficult shot to do in the entire movie was this one. Did you notice why? The apple rolls in the frame, the camera pushes forward until the apple stops right in the middle of the frame. I did this on my own because I shot that moment on that reshoot day as well. This shot took well over 100 takes to get right, because there were actually few things that had to work at the same time. With one hand I had to roll the apple, which had to stop rolling right in the middle of the frame, and with my other hand I had to push the camera on my cheap slider forward. And since I couldn't pull focus, the distance of the apple to the lens had to be the same throughout. Out of the many takes I did, there were only a handful where it all worked out, but only one that was perfect. And yes, we also had some fun shooting with a cat. I ended up doing the whole post-production myself, which also meant that I needed to teach myself how to do a lot of the work like visual effects and sound design in the first place, which took a lot of time, but your first short films are mostly for learning anyways, so that was fine. For most of the post-production I used the apps from the Adobe Cloud like Premiere Pro or After Effects. When I started editing, I was surprised how well a lot of the shots actually worked together, so I stuck pretty much to my original plan and just cut the scenes the way I intended to in the shot list. One of the most difficult things here was to figure out how long the different shots needed to last. Take for example this scene. I just couldn't decide how long this POV shot of her should be. And this gets even harder when you're watching a scene over and over again. Remember that I've mentioned before that I took some heavy inspiration from other films while doing the shot list? Well, what I ended up doing was I just looked at the editing of those movies, and I think now is a good point to actually show you a quick side by side.
Name? Name?
Well, now it's pretty obvious. So coming back to the POV shot, I just checked how long the same shot in Gone Girl lasts, which is exactly 1 second and 14 frames. This technique is super helpful when you're starting out as an editor. Don't be afraid to steal things from other movies you like and mix them in your own work. Most people won't even notice it, and even if they do, it's alright, even some great directors do it. More challenging were the few visual effects I had to do. The 2 scenes outside in the garden needed the most work. That is because there was no garden behind the house. We shot that scene somewhere else on the property, in bright daylight, right next to a busy street. Doing an effect like this is called a day to night, and is often used in movies. But just lowering the brightness of the scene won't do the trick, because first, your talent will be too dark, and second, the sky will be too bright. I won't go into detail here, there are a lot of other people online that can explain this much better than me, but I want to give you a basic idea of the process. First, I used the black and white mask to remove the sky and simply place an image of a night sky as a layer underneath it. The next thing is that you want as much darkness as possible in your frame without losing your actors. So back in Premiere, I masked out certain areas of the frame, like the actors, so I could control them in the grading separately. Now I could darken the background, then the actors, and then all together with an adjustment layer to give it a final look. I did this in Premiere instead of After Effects because I was handling all the grading here, but you could do this step right in After Effects as well. Another 4x shot I had to do was the big scar on Emily's face. We had no makeup artist on set, so all we did was to put some fake blood on our actress's face. I made the fake blood in our kitchen the day before. Now I could just blend the visual effect with the real thing, which makes the effect much more seamless. I used this take in particular for the final cut, because Emily rolls out of frame for a moment. That's perfect because you can't see the scar before she rolls out, but when the camera pans back to her, her head is already lying pretty still on the ground. So now all I had to do was to create a 2D image of the scar and do a simple 2D track in After Effects. If I had used any of the other takes where the head turn is visible, I might have needed to do the shot all in 3D, which is a lot harder. To create a scar in Photoshop, I blended a few different images together and simply painted the rest. For example, I used this fun image of a walker for parts of the insides of the wound. Then I tracked the scar onto the footage and it looks a bit fake in daylight, but after I've applied the day to night effect, it looks good enough. The sound design was another area where I had pretty much no experience, and I didn't know how to use any of the professional programs like Adobe Audition, so I decided to just do it in Premiere. I also didn't do much extra Foley recording for this film, other than a few small things like the light switch and the apples rolling on the ground. Instead I used Soundly, which is a really cheap monthly subscription-based program / sound library. That's perfect because you can just subscribe to it as long as you need, and then cancel your subscription when you're done with the project. It also works great with Premiere. You can just drag and drop the sounds directly from the app onto your timeline. They had pretty much all the sounds I needed, like squeaking doors, cloth sounds, creaky steps, creepy room tones, and even some awesome sounds for the monster. I replaced most of the sound in post because that way you have much more control. Take this moment for example. I didn't like the creak of the floor when Lily walks in. So now compare to the replaced sound. Much better, right? Sometimes you could also hear cars and other noises in the background. And for the scenes outside I had to create the whole soundscape from scratch, because overall it was just a matter of finding the right sound clips and then mix and layer them together. Like I couldn't find the right sound for the store, so I put 3 different audio clips together to create the final sound. You can also have some fun here, like I needed a dark atmospheric room tone for the basement that covered the whole scene, and I didn't really want to go with the usual water-dripping basement room tone that a lot of basement scenes use. Instead I wanted something dark and mysterious. I came across this underwater ambience track and I just love how well it fits the scene. It really makes you feel like the basement is in some other world deep underground. You can really elevate your project a lot with your sound design, and I recommend that you put some time and effort into this. It helps to make your movie look much more professional in the end. Funny enough, I've started sending the short film to some smaller film festivals, and it actually won an award for the sound design. So for someone who didn't know much about sound before, this was a big deal, and also kind of ironic. And if I can learn the basics about sound design and then even get an award for it, everyone can. I can't tell you much about the music in the film since I used to serve as artlist for the whole score. It took a while to find the right tracks for each scene, but it worked out fine in the end. My big takeaway here was, if I don't work with a composer on my next projects, I'll probably start searching for the music much earlier in the process. The score is also something that I see a lot of short films overlook, but I find that the music is one of the most important aspects of a film. So again, I recommend that you put as much effort as you can into this. Well, you can't believe how happy I was when I rented out the final version of the film. With all the learning and trying out new programs and workflows, it really took me a minute to finish all the post-production work. I wasn't completely happy with the film, of course, and in the end there are so many things that you could improve on. But yeah, those first short films, and especially your very first short film, are there to make mistakes, so you hopefully won't make them again later on. I hope I could help some of you with the things I've learned on my first short film. I'll link everything I've mentioned in the description, and of course if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments as well. The thing is, making a short film is really just half of the work, because after you're finished, you still want to somehow get people to actually see it. And that's when the real fun begins.